Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more of the executive branch of the United States, this time looking at the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. We looked at Thomas Jefferson himself, his cabinet. Now, let's look at his presidency. We are going to start off first by looking at a timeline I've found of some events during the Jefferson presidency. February 13th, 1801. The Judiciary Act of 1801 expands federal court jurisdiction, creating 16 new circuit court judges. March 4th, 1801. Jefferson is inaugurated as the third president of the United States. I've mentioned this before. Back in in the day when the first few presidents were going, we didn't swear them into office until March. Today, we do it. It's like early to mid January in that area there. But, yeah. May 1804 to June 1805, the United States defeats Tripoli in the First Barbary War. And, yeah. If you know anything of the Marine anthem, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Yeah, the Barbary War was a war we were having with I believe it was a number of pirates. There we go. Let's see. The total war was 4 years and 1 month, but yeah, it was off the Mediterranean coast of Tripoli, Derna. And Tripoli, historically known as Tripoli of the West, capital and largest city of Libya. So, North Africa. Derna, a port city in eastern Libya. So, yeah. North Africa. It was the U.S., Sweden, and Sicily versus Ottoman Tripolitania. So if anyone ever asks you if you know any real old wars besides the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War, Barbary Wars, or Tripolitan War, Barbary Coast War, yeah. That is a war we went through between the two, so. But yeah, we finally, in the war, May 1804 to June 1805. Back into 1801, October the 7th, 1801, the Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut writes to Thomas Jefferson complaining about the lack of protection for the religious freedom of minority religions in Connecticut. January 1st, 1802, Thomas Jefferson replies in a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut affirming that the First Amendment created a wall of separation between church and state. I'm so tired of people trying to... it's not what Yeah, that is what Jefferson said. Him and Madison confirmed it multiple times. January 22nd, 1802, Congress repeals the Judiciary Act of 1801. February 24th, 1803, the Supreme Court establishes the principle of judicial review in its Marbury versus Madison decision. Yeah, very important, very large case. It gave the court the ability to look at laws and say, no, this isn't constitutional. And it was this case right here, Marbury versus Madison, that decided it. April 30th, 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubles the size of the U.S. We gain from New Orleans this large swath across the country. Yeah, and it would just completely double the size of the young country. November to December 1803. In the Mary affair, Thomas Jefferson offends Britain's new diplomatic minister, Anthony Mary, with informal protocol during White House events. March the 12th, 1804. House of Representatives impeaches Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase for injecting politics into judicial proceedings. It shows you how far we've fallen under Trump. May 1804 to September 1806. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark complete an expedition from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. So I think it's in St. Louis they start out from, and they travel that entire expanse of the nation where they just bought that huge portion of land. So they traverse to the Pacific side of the continent to really get an idea of what the entire continent is like, and the idea of how big the U.S. is now. November 1804, Jefferson wins re-election in a landslide, 162 to 14 in electoral votes. So yeah, remember, what really counts is the Electoral College, which is really undemocratic, but it's how presidents win, even though they don't win the majority of the popular vote. And really, the Electoral College needs to go. March 1st, 1805. The Senate acquits Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase after his impeachment trial. So the House said, yes, you must go through trial, and the Senate put him through the impeachment trial, but acquits him. They do not find him guilty, and thus he's free to go. 1806, Thomas Jefferson supports a ban on trade with Haiti. Remember, at this point, I think it's a free nation at this point, but it had been a slave trade nation and everything, so but he puts a ban on trade with Haiti. June the 22nd, 1807. 3 U.S. seamen are killed and 18 wounded when a British ship attempts to seize suspected British deserters on board the USS Chesapeake. So, yeah, they proclaim they're looking for deserters on the Chesapeake, but what they do is they're like, whoa, we're going to force you to stop. They did fire upon the Chesapeake, and like we said, 3 U.S. sailors killed, 18 wounded. December of 1807, Jefferson implements an embargo on all U.S. exports to protect U.S. ships and coerce a more reasonable policy from Britain and France. Yeah. At this point, Britain and France were in conflict. Because I think it was the Napoleonic Wars that were going on at this point. But anyway, let me verify that. Napoleonic Wars. 1803 to 1815. So yeah, that's what's going on. Napoleon is in charge of France, and Britain's one of the big nations against them in all this. So yeah. And so Jefferson implements this policy because one of the other things that was going on at this point was something called impressment. Capturing U.S. ships and sailors and forcing them to work in the British Navy, and apparently it must have also been in the French Navy. I can't confirm France, but we know Britain definitely. So yeah. And so Jefferson basically says, we're not sending anything to Britain and France, so we can protect our ships until you all are more reasonable with us. But that would open the door to a war around the corner. The War of 1812. But before that, November 1808, James Madison is elected president and largely continues Jefferson's policies. And January 6th, way down the line, 1879, the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in the case Reynolds versus the U.S. cites Thomas Jefferson's 1878 letter concerning the separation of church and state. I don't think they meant 1878. They might have meant 1802 or whatever it was with the Danbury, Connecticut. Yeah. 1801, 1802. I don't know why they wrote 1878. I think that was a mistake. But yeah, we get a good timeline at Jefferson. Now, let's see. This is from themillercenter.org. Thomas Jefferson's presidency initiated the quarter-century rule of the Virginia dynasty, 1801 to 1825. Probably should have been earlier, because technically Washington was Virginia. But, yeah. That included the presidencies of loyal Jeffersonians, James Madison and James Monroe, and of course Jefferson. Yeah, those three guys were all from Virginia. Like I said, 4 of the first 5 presidents were Virginians. But yeah, as the center of political gravity shifted south toward the Republican ascendancy, the party gained new strength to the north, progressively marginalizing Federalists as an effective national opposition party. But the founders' fantasy of faction-free politics was not to be fulfilled. Emerging splits among Republicans themselves pitted orthodox street constructionist old Republicans against national Republicans who favored a more positive and activist, according to critics, Hamiltonian, who favored a conception of federal power. Yeah, remember, Hamilton and other Federalists thought there should be a federal government that runs everything, more or less. But back in this day, there were still a lot of people who were against the idea of an overruling group overruling the states. But yeah. Quarrels among Jeffersonian Republicans foreshadowed the division between Jacksonian Democrats, self-proclaimed legatees of Jeffersonian orthodoxy, and Whigs, who promoted a neo-federalist national Republican policy agenda while warning against King Andrew's dangerous consolidation of authority. So yeah. And King Andrew, of course, they're calling Andrew Jackson King Andrew, because he tried to do a lot without caring what either branch really said. Very Trumpian. But anyway, Jefferson's performance as president justified divergent conceptions of executive power, known for his hostility to strong central government and the judicial overreach of the Supreme Court under John Marshall. Jefferson nevertheless jettisoned strict construction when the nation's vital interests were threatened. Self-preservation, the first law of nature and nations, took precedence over the constitutional limits that he scrupulously observed in peacetime, while Andrew Jackson embraced this robust conception of his presidential power, even as his Whig opponents drew inspiration from Jefferson's anti-monarchical precepts. Jefferson has been a great Democratic icon precisely because he so eloquently articulated fundamental tensions in America's understanding of the people's power and had the strongest government on earth. Or that the United States had the strongest government on earth. It wasn't necessarily the strongest country, especially back in his day, but it had the strongest government, a government truly of the people. Jefferson told his fellow Americans in his first inaugural address on March 4th, 1801. Yet the people's great and irresistible power was a function of their devotion to a free government that guaranteed their rights. This was the only government where every man at the call of the law would fly to the standard of the law and would meet invasions of public order as his own personal concern. Where an enlightened people determined their own destiny, Jefferson promised, there was no necessary or inevitable conflict between private rights and public goods. So yeah, it should always be more for the people. People have rights, but they cannot, interfere with what's better for the nation itself. And what's good for the nation itself shouldn't trample over people's rights. Jefferson will always be celebrated for articulating the American national creed, the fundamental and universal principles of self-government that he set forth in the Declaration of Independence, and at the same time, those very principles, most notably that all men are created equal, have been turned against him as successive generations of critics have condemned him as a hypocritical slave owner. Jefferson cannot escape criticism. He failed to emancipate his own slaves, and he presided over the peculiar institution's rapid expansion to the South and West. Yet the conflicts that shaped the new nation's history and Jefferson's career defied easy solutions. Yeah. Jefferson wanted to release slaves. There's often suggested of this, and that he was forced to keep it in the Constitution, that slavery was a part of the nation. He would get so much pushback. But, yeah. That's how we got to the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution. Jefferson and his contemporaries struggled, often unsuccessfully, to reconcile the conflicting claims of nation building and natural rights, of power and liberty, and of slavery and freedom. Their legacy to us is the history of the conflicts that engaged them, and should engage us in fulfilling the American Revolution's promise to the nation and the world. So yeah. Not a perfect leader, because there are serious negatives, things you can criticize Jefferson for. But all in all, it feels like he did a pretty good job as president. Like I said, there are things you can easily criticize him for, but there's a lot of good things too. So he's very much, he's human. He's got a mixed bag of what you can count. But yeah, American founding father, principal author of the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming colonial rule from England, and the third president of the United States. In the thick of party conflict in 1800, Jefferson wrote in a private letter, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." Let's see, it talks about him being born to a fairly well-off family, inheriting from his father, who was a planner and surveyor, some 5,000 acres of land, and from his mother, who was a Randolph, high social standing. Studied at the College of William and Mary, college that still exists, read law, and in 1772 married Martha Wells Skelton, a widow, and took her to live in his partly constructed mountaintop home, Monticello. Let's see. He was no public speaker. In the Virginia House of Burgesses and the Continental Congress, he contributed his pen rather than his voice to the patriot cause. As the silent member of Congress, Jefferson, at age 33, drafted the Declaration of Independence. In years following, he labored to make its words a reality in Virginia. Most notably, he wrote a bill establishing religious freedom enacted in 1786. Jefferson succeeded Benjamin Franklin as minister to France in 1785. His sympathy for the French Revolution led him into conflict with Alexander Hamilton when Jefferson was the Secretary of State for Washington, and he would resign in 1793. Yeah, Jefferson and Hamilton conflicted quite a bit because of their political views. Sharp political conflict developed between and two separate parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, began to form. John Adams, the second president, was a Federalist. Jefferson gradually assumed leadership of the Republicans, who sympathized with the revolutionary cause in France. Attacking Federalist policies, he opposed a strong centralized government and championed the rights of states. Like I said, states' rights were a big, big thing at that point. As a reluctant candidate for president in 1796, Jefferson came within 3 votes of election. Through a flaw in the Constitution, he became vice president, although an opponent of President Adams, who won the presidency. In 1800, the defect caused a more serious problem. Republican electors attempting to name both a president and a vice president from their party cast a tie vote between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. The House of Representatives settled the tie. Hamilton, disliking both Jefferson and Burr, nevertheless urged Jefferson's election, so he pushed Jefferson over Burr. When Jefferson assumed the presidency, the crisis in France had passed. He slashed Army and Navy expenditures, cut the budget, eliminated the tax on whiskey, so unpopular in the West, yet reduced the national debt by a third. He also sent a naval squadron to fight the Barbary pirates who were harassing American commerce in the Mediterranean. Further, although the Constitution made no provision for the acquisition of new land, Jefferson suppressed his qualms over constitutionality when he had the opportunity to acquire the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon in 1803. So yeah, purchase of all that land doubles the size and unfortunately really confirms the idea of the nationalist expansion. I'm forgetting what the term is. But yeah, basically saying America has a duty to expand from coast to coast. But yeah. In his second term, he was increasingly preoccupied with keeping the nation from involvement in the Napoleonic Wars. Like I said, Napoleon was fighting with a number of other nations. Although both England and France interfered with the neutral rights of American merchantmen, impressment, Jefferson's attempted solution was an embargo upon American shipping that worked badly and was unpopular. So yeah. What else can we look at for Jefferson here? He had 3 Supreme Court justices. Yeah, these were the 3. He had 3 Supreme Court justices. William Johnson, from South Carolina, Henry Brockhost Livingston from New York, and Thomas Todd from Kentucky. All 3 were justices put on the Supreme Court under Jefferson's presidency. He only had 3 Supreme Court members, and Todd was a completely new seat, so yeah. But anyway, let's pull this. This gives us a look at some of the important points in the nation for what happened. Shores of Tripoli, the Barbary War here in northern Africa, mainly Libya. Then back in the U.S., you have New Orleans, which was from the point of the Louisiana Purchase that spread this whole area of the nation. Yeah. It would just leave like Texas up through California, which we would get a few decades later in the Mexican-American War. The William and Clark expedition would start here in St. Louis. But yeah, Massachusetts, Connecticut here. The letter to Danbury Baptist Association when they talk about the separation of church and state. One of the biggest things Jefferson promoted. It was something he wanted to make absolutely clear. We have a copy of Jefferson's reply here. Two Messrs, Nehemiah Dodge, Ephraim Robbins, and Stephen S. Nelson, a committee of the Danbury Baptist Association in the state of Connecticut. Gentlemen, the affectionate sentiments of esteem and approbation which you are so good as to express towards me, on behalf of the Danbury Baptist Association, give me the highest satisfaction. My duties dictate a faithful and zealous pursuit of the interest of my constituents, and in proportion as they are pursued or persuaded of my fidelity to those duties, the discharge of them becomes more and more pleasing. Believing that with you that a religion is a matter that which lies solely between a man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislatures should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state, adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition of his social duties. I appreciate your kind prayers for the protection and blessing of the common Father and Creator of man, and tender you for yourselves and your religious association assurances of my high respect and esteem. Thomas Jefferson. So right there he says, there is a separation between church and state. State should have no role in prohibiting an exercise of religion. That means anybody should have the right to practice whatever religion they want, and shall not respect an establishment of religion. Some people say that's the creation of a new religion. I think it just means any place of religion or any form of religion. So, yeah. Regardless, it means church shouldn't go into politics, politics shouldn't go into religion. They should be kept separate, unlike what some people try to do. But yeah. Let's see, what else we got? Yeah, the 1800 election. It's what brought about the need for running mates instead of running for president and running for vice president, because we had 2 straight elections where it made that rule in the Constitution show it is very flawed. But yeah, because you have Jefferson lost 3 votes to Hamilton, and they were strongly opposed to each other's ideas. But because of the way the Constitution was written, Hamilton would become president, Jefferson become vice president. And then there was such a mess up again with the next election. Burr and Jefferson tied. After that, they were like, yeah, we got to fix this. And we got an amendment that did fix it. But yeah. And now it's president picks a running mate. Jefferson would conflict with Chief Justice John Marshall, who actually was one of the better Chief Justices on the Supreme Court. But yeah. After the election, the results of the election of 1800 became known. The lame duck Federalist Congress and President John Adams, in their last days, sought to limit the impact of the Democratic-Republican victory by ensuring Federalist control of a larger and more powerful judiciary, and thus implemented the Judiciary Act of 1801. And that was only 4 days before Jefferson's Electoral College victory, and expanded the federal court jurisdiction. So there's more of a chance of striking down things through the courts with this expanded judicial system. But 16 new circuit court judges, and eliminated the necessity of Supreme Court justices to ride circuit through the states to hear appeals with local district court judges. Jefferson viewed the new circuit courts as an unnecessary expansion of federal power, and the midnight judges, as the new circuit judges they were called, appointed by the lame duck Adams, was as an unwarranted attack on his newly elected government. Over desultory constitutional objections, he supported legislation eliminating the circuit courts and restoring the riding circuit for Supreme Court justices, with the circuit courts abolished. Jefferson was effectively able to fire the 16 new Federalist judges who would otherwise have been beyond his control. The Judiciary Act also created a group of local Washington, D.C. magistrates. Among those named to the new position was William Marbury, but his commission, while signed before Jefferson was inaugurated, had not been delivered. And this is where the Marbury versus Madison suit comes up. Jefferson took the position that a commission was not valid until delivered, and ordered Secretary of State James Madison to withhold it. Marbury sued in the Supreme Court, seeking to force Madison to deliver his commission. In 1803, Marbury versus Madison case, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall decided that Marbury's commission was valid. It had no jurisdiction over the dispute because the law granting it that authority was itself unconstitutional. While technically a victory for Jefferson, the case, which had been called the most consequential in history of the Supreme Court, confirmed the principle of judicial review, the power of the Supreme Court to declare unconstitutional an act passed by Congress and signed by the President. Something that had become an important part of checks and balances. Until we got an all-Republican shitbag government who's destroyed our nation. Anyway, let's see. The Danbury Baptist letter, we talked about that. The Barbary War, we talked about for some. The Mary affair. In the 1790s, Democratic Republicans had criticized the administrations of both George Washington and John Adams for mimicking British monarchical practices, from formal levees to bowing when greeting the president. Jefferson believed that such practices would undermine the clear understanding that in a republic, all citizens were equal before the law. Again, presidents were meant to be public servants of the people. You were elected to lead. They didn't want a king. Jefferson did not include women or African Americans among those to whom equal rights were owed, as was the tendency, unfortunately. As president, Jefferson took the opportunity to embrace publicly a far more plebeian style, even when his actions sometimes offended European or political sensibilities, as was the case in what became known as the Mary Affair. November 1803, Britain's new diplomatic minister, Anthony Merry, came to present his credentials to Jefferson in full diplomatic regalia, complete with a plumed hat and dress sword. He was appalled to be received by the president in informal dress, including a pair of slippers. Jefferson multiplied the insult in the eyes of the new diplomat and his wife, Elizabeth Mary, when they were invited to dinner at the president's house and were seated pell-mell with no attention paid to rank, rather than the minister's wife being escorted first to the dining room by the president as protocol dictated. An angry communique from Britain followed, insisting that not only had Mary been insulted, but by extension so had King George. Similar breaches of formal protocol annoyed the Spanish minister, Marquis de Casa Irujo, and his wife, Sarah McKean Irujo, the daughter of the governor of Pennsylvania. Jefferson was not trying to be rude, rather, he was making a point about the lack of formal titles and pomp in America. He had made the same point when he decided to walk to his inauguration, and when each year on January the 1st he opened the president's house for a reception that welcomed not only members of Congress and the diplomatic corps, but also scores of ordinary citizens. It truly, as much as it could be at that point, be the people's president, the people's house. Jefferson wanted it to be clear that he wasn't trying to be like the old guard. You have to dress in certain ways and act certain ways and present things in certain ways. If we still did that, you know how bad Trump would screw that up? The Louisiana Purchase. That's because Trump's an idiot, though. Lewis and Clark expedition. Jefferson and the native peoples. While Jefferson said he hoped to live in perpetual peace with the indigenous tribes, he believed the native people should adopt American farming practices, spinning and weaving, and assimilate into U.S. culture, unlike his well-known view that after emancipation, free African Americans should be colonized elsewhere. Such assimilation would also mean that native people, having given up hunting and a semi-nomadic lifestyle, could sell unneeded land to the U.S., which was another of his major goals. In fact, Jefferson advised the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, future president, to run indigenous people in debt to encourage the sale of land. If they did not assimilate, incorporating with us as citizens of the U.S., then Jefferson believed that they should move or be removed beyond the Mississippi. So yeah, basically force them further west. Alternative was extermination. So not much choice at all. Jefferson's legacy is wrapped up in the issue of slavery. He wrote that all men are created equal, but still own more than 600 people, including some of his own children. Slavery, though, did not take a prominent role in his presidency, and it took during the later antebellum period, as sectional hostilities took hold, furthered in part by the new territory added by the Louisiana Purchase and the expansion of slavery into the growing nation. Jefferson did support legislation in 1807 that banned the international slave trade, effective January 1st, 1808, the first day permitted under the U.S. Constitution. However, this created a booming domestic slave trade that particularly benefited enslavers in upper South states like Virginia, who had an excess of enslaved labor for their agricultural needs and found a ready market in the new territory. So he did ban new slaves being brought from Africa and being traded into the U.S. That was no longer allowed. But yeah. Jefferson also undermined diplomatic relations with the former French colony of Saint-Domingue, known as Haiti today, in the aftermath of the slave rebellion there led by Toussaint Louverture. I'm probably butchering that name. That began in 1791. Both Washington and Adams encouraged trade with the formerly enslaved inhabitants, and Adams sent a consul to engage with Louverture and his followers, not fathers. In 1806, Jefferson supported a ban on trade with Haiti, ostensibly to assuage France. But, like other enslavers, he clearly feared the influence of a successful slavery revolt so close. I've suddenly got where I cannot speak. So close to the U.S. South. In 1802, he wrote to Rufus King, U.S. Minister in London, that the course of things in the neighboring islands of the West Indies appears to have given a considerable impulse to the minds of slaves, a great disposition to insurgency has manifested itself among them. He referenced a recently foiled uprising in Virginia by a participant in Gabriel's conspiracy, which also had been linked to the Haitian revolt. But yeah, we talked about the embargo with Britain and France. But yeah, that gives us a good look at Jefferson's presidency. And like I said, there's plenty of other links I have available here looking at the presidency as a whole. It gets hard sometimes to fit all the information into these things. Goodness knows I don't always have the time to sit down and write it out like I would like I should. But anyway, yeah, we'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting my links and sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. See you all in the next one. Until then, later.